All right, and can everyone see my screen? I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, and thank you to the library for allowing us to present on grief during COVID-19. We appreciate you taking time out of your evening to participate in tonight's webinar, so thank you so much. Second, I know that grief can certainly be a heavy and sometimes tricky and triggering subject to navigate and discuss. So if at any point during the presentation you need to put your head down or close your eyes, I take no offense to that. I recognize that self-care is important. And third, if you have any questions or comments during this presentation, feel free to unmute your mics and ask or comment away. I know we have a cozy group tonight, and so for this to be discussion-based, I'm totally open to that and appreciate any feedback that you may have. With the hustle and bustle of the virtual world, I may not always see a polite hand raise, but if you unmute your microphones, I will be able to hear that. And lastly, before we get started with tonight's presentation, I wanted to take a moment to introduce myself and my background. So I'm not just a virtual strange face staring at you from across the screen. It can be tough in these virtual presentations, so I want to make it as personal as possible and have you get to know me. So my name is Taryn Lancaster, and I am a community grief specialist at the Grace Grief Support Center. I have been working for Grace for just over a year. I celebrated my 1-year anniversary last Wednesday. I love Grace. I cannot say enough good things about it, but admit that I may be a bit biased. Before arriving to Grace, I obtained my bachelor's degree in child life at Edgewood College. And a lot of my experiences during my college career were with children and families in children's hospitals. And at the same time, while I was working on my degree, I was also a volunteer at the Grace Grief Support Center for our family program. And after my experience there, I felt so valued as a volunteer, and I really admired the work that the grief support specialists at the center did. And I just knew that my journey with the Grace was nowhere close to being finished. So here we are. And at the end of this presentation, there is a video explaining the functionality and what we do at the Grief Support Center. So I will try not to be repetitive right now, as I think the video portrays a much better visual than what I could ever explain in words with what we do there. But some of my favorite things within my role at a Grace, I love working with our children and families. We serve both individuals and in group settings. And I also love community engagement and community outreach, such as this in-service and presenting to the public. Another area that I really enjoy is volunteer engagement. We could not run without our volunteers, and we are really thankful for our volunteer base. This year, I will have a master's degree in thanatology, which is the scientific study of death and dying. So that will further help me be able to serve the community and within my position at a Grace. All right, now that I've kind of shared about myself, we will move on and start our presentation with grief during COVID-19. So after our time here today, I would love to increase your understanding of what common grief reactions are, discuss complicated grief and how COVID-19 impacts grief, and share ideas on how to best support grieving people. So first, a little bit about grief itself without COVID-19 into the mix. Grief is a natural response to any sort of loss that is viewed as significant to the person. What may be significant to me may not be significant to someone else. Again, it's really person-centered. Grief is not a problem that can be fixed or solved. I think society really likes when there are easy fixes or easy solutions to a problem, but that's not grief. There is no magic pill that can simply make grief go away or vanish. There is no timeline to grief as much as we wish there was. There's not, and we'll talk about that further in another slide. Grief is not a linear journey. It does not go from start to end. It's a lot of room in between. It's not linear. It can go up and down and up and down and back again. No two people grieve the same. My grief may look different from your grief, and your grief may look different from your family's grief, and that is okay. Also, grief can be impacted by various factors. Such factors include the relationship to the person that died and the quality of the relationship. For example, I may have a healthy relationship with one of my family members that died, but my brother may not have had a healthy relationship with that person, and that impacts how we grieve, even though we're grieving the same person. Another factor that can impact grief are the circumstances of the death. For example, was the death sudden? Was it expected? Was it suicide? Was it murder? There are a lot of different circumstances that can alter the trajectory of grief. Further, grief can be impacted by the coping skills a person may have. What coping skills do they have in place already? And access to resources. For example, in more rural settings, in more rural communities, there aren't always abundant resources for mental health or for grief. In this virtual world, we have come to recognize that not everyone has Wi-Fi connection, and that may limit their access to resources right now. So while we're talking about grief reactions, I want to show a model of grief that resonates with a lot of people. It's called the dual process of grief. And this was created by Strobe and Schutt, and it's everyday life experience. You can oscillate between loss-oriented and restoration-oriented. And loss-oriented is really focused on grief work, intrusion of grief, breaking bonds, ties, and relocation, denial, avoidance of restoration changes. But again, it can oscillate to more restoration-oriented, which is attending to life changes, doing new things, distracting oneself from grief. So maybe going to work or going out with friends. It doesn't mean that you're not grieving, but you're distracting yourself from that grief. Denial and avoidance of grief, new roles and identities in relationships. And you can oscillate back and forth between these two types daily. Next, I would like to show a visual that really sums up grief. How we want grief to work, right? A linear version, smooth ride from start to finish. But this is actually how grief works on the right. And when we think of grief, society often thinks of a 5-stage-based model by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So your 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. However, not everyone goes through those stages. And those stages you may have anger one day, and then avoidance the next, and then anger the next day. It's not a simple stage-based model from start to finish. You can go back and forth throughout your entire grief journey. Grief is more than sadness. So I would like to open a bit of discussion here, if you are comfortable. What other emotions might be part of the grief response? And fear is certainly an emotion that might be part of the grief response, as we discussed. Some other emotions that may be felt include guilty, numb, confused, such as, why did this happen, that you were questioning earlier, jealous, lonely, foggy, anxious, that what if feeling again, exhausted. Grief is not just an emotional response, it is also a physical response, and you can feel it in your entire body. You can be exhausted, you can feel nauseous as well, and it can interrupt a lot of your life, not just the emotional aspect. Distracted, despair, isolated, helpless, weak. And another feeling that I want to touch on that sometimes I have participants in our groups kind of whisper, they say that they feel relieved. And that is okay. And that is a normal response to grief. We often discuss the sadness associated with grief, but relief is there. Someone may feel relieved that their loved one that died is no longer in pain. And so they may go through bouts of relief or gratitude that they have passed on or died. Grief reactions are as varied as the people who experience them. Again, my grief is going to be different from each and every one of you, and your grief is going to be different than each and every one of us. All of this is normal. Wanting to isolate is normal, silent weeping, vocal wailing, being with others, feeling frazzled and overwhelmed, finding joy and connection. And as we discussed earlier, kids also grieve in their own ways. Kids tend to oscillate more frequently than adults. A lot of adults sometimes say, well, I don't think my child is grieving, but that's because they may not be openly wailing, or they may not be openly discussing their grief in the same way adults do. Their grief may come out in play, and that's why therapeutic play can be really helpful and important in addressing a child's grief. So anticipatory grief, grief that occurs as we anticipate a loss, or as we first understand that death is a probable or potential outcome. We can grieve losses of independence, mobility, plans, and dreams. It may not just be the death that we are grieving, but other factors as well. Many of the same emotions as grief after a death. And it's important not to assume that just because a death was anticipated, that it doesn't mean that post-death grief will be better or worse than if it were not expected. Next, we will discuss complicated grief and how COVID-19 is impacting grief. Before we jump in, I want to start with a definition of complicated grief, and then we'll move into what complicated grief actually looks like and its correlation to COVID-19. So complicated grief is a persistent form of intense grief in which maladaptive thoughts and dysfunctional behaviors are present, along with continued yearning, longing, and sadness, and/or preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the person who died. Grief continues to dominate life, and the future seems bleak and empty. Irrational thoughts that the deceased person might reappear are common, and the bereaved person feels lost and alone. And that's from the Columbia Center for Complicated Grief. Approximately 20 to 30% of people are at risk of developing complicated grief, and about 15% of those people will exhibit complicated grief. So not everyone that is at risk will actually exhibit complicated grief. Jumping back into complicated grief, This percentage, I wouldn't be surprised if it increased after research is done regarding COVID-19. It's just too early for those studies to be done and for peer-reviewed articles to be published on the matter, but I, again, would not be surprised if complicated grief percentages increased over time. So what can complicated grief look like? Again, experts don't have a lot of research yet to draw from regarding COVID-19, but this is what some grief experts are expecting to see as it is related to grief responses being heightened due to COVID-19. Trauma from being separated from a loved one at end of life. This can be seen because currently, throughout the last 10 months or throughout COVID-19 and this pandemic, loved ones aren't always able to be by someone's bedside as they are actively dying or within a hospice room at end of life. And so that may cause increased trauma from being separated from a loved one in the future. A heightened sense of threat or hyper alertness, panic when the phone rings, and obsessing over data related to COVID-19. Constant need to turn on the news and to watch the numbers increase. Increased stress and anxiety. Feeling that they or their loved ones are being stigmatized. An example of being stigmatized would be, well, how did your loved one get COVID? Were they being safe? Did they go to a party? Were they reckless? And that being stigmatized can be an awful feeling to experience. Rumination and questioning. Did my loved one suffer? Were they alone? Will others get it and die too? Did we mess up? Hindsight bias. I should have known not to go there. I shouldn't have let them go to that birthday party. I should not have let them go eat at that restaurant. A lot of hindsight bias and sometimes regret. Loss and frustration due to changes in or lack of rituals. We have seen that end-of-life services have had to change because of COVID-19. We have seen funerals having to change and end-of-life celebration, and that can certainly spark frustration. Social and emotional isolation, guilt and regret, anger, displacement of anger and frustration onto funeral professionals and other professionals involved, increased negative coping, such as substance abuse, avoidance, and withdrawal. Certainly, we have experienced COVID-19 deaths during this pandemic, but we have also seen an increase in suicide as well. And so there are mental health implications, even if one does not contract COVID-19. Inflexibility. If I can't have the funeral, then we won't do anything at all. Feeling cheated out of an opportunity to say goodbye. As we mentioned earlier, not everyone gets the opportunity to say goodbye to a loved one with COVID-19 or another illness because of protocols and precautions that hospitals and or hospices have to take. So what about COVID-19 contributes to complicated grief? During the pandemic, of course, we have had COVID and non-COVID related deaths, and both can cause complicated grief. I think we can all understand that even if someone didn't die of COVID, their family's grief will be impacted by COVID nonetheless, as we discussed in the slide before. So when we are all experiencing the effects of a COVID pandemic or of a global pandemic, how does that contribute to complicated grief? COVID deaths are often sudden and unexpected. Even if the person had another health concern going on, complicated grief is going to be likely. And a question here that I have been pondering, will complicated grief be the next pandemic? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? You've been isolated, and so you haven't had that comfort of your loved ones. And we as humans, we're not designed to be in social isolation. That's not healthy for us. And now that we are facing those unhealthy consequences of that, which can lead to complicated grief. And so it can be extremely hard to not have a hug from a friend or a hug from a loved one. And you mentioned choice, and this pandemic, COVID-19, has really impeded on personal decisions and choices that we make that we may not really have to think that hard about, or that we didn't have to think that hard about prior to this onset. And again, you talked about feeling shamed for the decisions that you made, for going to a service or for hugging a loved one. And that goes back to that stigma that loved ones may face. And so that can certainly lead to complicated grief and feeling like you have to be closed off when discussing your experiences and not be as open or share your experiences because you don't want to be stigmatized by your friends and your family for the choices that you made. Every single decision that we make and every single choice that we make that may not have been there before. You know, before we may have simply attended an end of life celebration and grieved, but now we need to think about who we sit next to, how close we're sitting, if we're going to hug that person, if it's okay to lick an envelope with a card inside. There are just so many steps and elements to think about. Again, that goes back to that hyper awareness that we never had to think about before. And that covers that potential stigma bullet point. I also want to discuss survivor's guilt, which is exactly how it sounds. If 2 or more people in the same family contract COVID-19 and only one of them dies, the surviving person can feel guilty. And if the death causation is related to COVID, someone may wonder, well, did my husband get COVID because I sent him to the store? Or was it my fault because I allowed the neighbors to come over for a bonfire? There can be a lot of self-blame and a lot of guilt when someone contracts COVID-19 and dies. And of course, as we discussed, the loss of rituals surrounding dying and death can contribute to complicated grief. So next, we are going to discuss what is most helpful, what to say, what to avoid saying, and what to do. So how can you help others? You can help by increasing your understanding of grief, which again, thank you all for being part of this webinar tonight, because by doing so, you are increasing your understanding of grief. You are seeking further education on the matter. So further, you can also understand that there is often a wave of grief that happens months after the death. We have participants in our grief support group that say around 6 months they feel another wave of grief, and that's when their support system starts dwindling. And so for everyone to understand that grief isn't just for a week or 2 weeks following a death, it's months and years, it's a journey. That's important to know. And there are also societal expectations, such as the casserole committee. It's very well-meaning to have a casserole committee, but what message does it send the family if the food stops arriving 2 weeks after a death? That they should have their acts together by then, right? Grief takes more energy than most people realize. So it's important to validate and reassure your friends if this is their experience. And if a friend approaches you and says, I don't know what's wrong with me, but I'm just really struggling with so-and-so's death right now. You can talk to them about how normal it is. Our society does a pretty bad job of acknowledging grief and also in supporting people. Grief can sometimes just be hidden and swept under the rug. People can be uncomfortable discussing it when it is a very normal part of life. I think that we are very death denying in our society. What does 3 or 5 days of bereavement leave tell an employee? That they should be over it by then. And of course, as we discussed, grief doesn't just go away. It's not fixed or solved. There's no magic pill that can make it vanish in 3 to 5 days. It's an ongoing journey. And that can lead someone to feel that they are grieving wrong, or that there is something wrong with them in their grieving journey, which may lead to them being closed off to discussing their grief experience. It's also important to recognize that grief impacts every aspect of life. There is not a corner of life that isn't affected by grief, which makes sense because, as we discussed, energy, when your whole life you are focusing so much energy, it makes sense that every aspect and every area of your life is going to be impacted by how much energy you're spending, such as physically and emotionally and mentally. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to navigate life as is, and with grief, it takes even more energy. So what can you say? We all want to help. We all want to do something to support our friends, to support ourselves, to support our loved ones. So what is the most helpful? We'll share some actual statements on the next slide. And importantly, if you are uncertain of someone's beliefs or values related to grief or death, it's important to ask them. And you can ask them about their religious or their spiritual or cultural preferences. And you can also be aware of their body language, facial expressions, breathing and sighing, and simply being present. There's a lot to say about nonverbal communication as well as verbal communication. So here are some actual statements that you can use. And before we go into and review these statements, I want to say that each person is different. And although we recognize and we have heard from our participants and our clients that these are helpful statements, not everyone may find them helpful. And that's okay, that's normal. So some of these statements that we have found helpful include, I'm not sure what would be most helpful, but I care and I am here. That's acknowledging that you don't know all the answers and you don't have all of the answers, but you're there to support them. Do you remember the time, the 4 of us? A lot of the times a person that is grieving, they really just want to hear about memories and say the name of a loved one that died. Frank was such a good cook. I'm going to miss his food at our get-togethers. Again, acknowledging that person's life and who that person was. I'm going to invite you to book club and you can say no, but I'm going to continue to invite you in case one day you change your mind. An open invitation. I'm going for a walk in an hour. Would you like to join me? There is no time limit to my support. I am willing to listen anytime, weeks, months, years from now. Sometimes when a person is grieving, they can feel like a burden to friends and family members. And so letting them know that there is no time limit to your support can be really helpful. How can I best support you? Or what do I need to know about your beliefs to best support you? I am a personal fan of this one because it's not a yes or no question. It allows the individual to engage in conversation and to have direct communication about what they need from you. I'm thinking of you today. We're honoring Mike by eating at his favorite restaurant. And that message can be shared at any point in time. Maybe it's on Mike's birthday, or Mike's death anniversary. Again, just letting them know that you care and that you remember that person's legacy. So what can you do? Oftentimes we want to do something for someone that is grieving. What can we do during COVID-19? Well, we can send something or drop something off on a doorstep. That can be done while social distancing and wearing masks. You can drop off groceries, a care package, flowers, a card, etc. Offer specific practical help. Maybe this person needs help with paperwork, or maybe their car needs to be taken in. Again, that practicality, even if it seems like a small gesture, it can be extremely helpful. Be willing to hear about their pain without trying to change it. If you try to talk them out of their pain, they will stop talking to you about their pain. So letting them be where they're at and listening. Not forgetting. It's important to write down important dates and then acknowledge them when they come around. Birthdays, anniversaries, or dates of death are important to acknowledge, and not just within the first year. It can be really beneficial to acknowledge those dates every year. Offer to help with a ritual or memorial event. Even though it can be challenging to plan a ritual or a memorial event right now, it can still be done, and you can certainly help them out with that and listen to their ideas. So now we are going to discuss what not to say. And again, I will reiterate that even though we have heard from our participants and our clients that these things are not helpful, one of you may find something on here helpful, and that's okay. Again, each person is different, and it's just important to ask. Anything with religious overtones, unless you know the person or family very well. We say this because you may say, oh, well, they're in heaven now, but that person may not believe in heaven, and so it might not be helpful. Anything that implies being dead is better than being alive. Comparing your own or others' experiences of loss. Any statement that begins with the words "at least." That can come off as silver lining the experience and saying, well, at least they didn't suffer, or at least they were old. That doesn't make it any better. It's not as empathetic as some of the things that you could say that would be more helpful. Any don't feeling, such as don't cry or don't worry about it, because clearly that person has feelings and they are worthy of acknowledging and being where they're at with those feelings. And this list on the left, we have actually gathered from our participants at one of our grief support groups at the center that they found not to be helpful. You'll have a new life. Your mom had a good, long life. You're not the only one who's lost someone. Although true, it doesn't really make someone feel better. They would have wanted you to live and be happy. I'm sorry for your loss. Again, that's one that some people find helpful, but what we have heard and what I have heard from children that I've worked with at the support center is that it gets really repetitive and they wonder, well, why are you sorry? You didn't kill my brother or sister. You didn't kill my mom or dad, so why are you sorry? Time heals all wounds. They're in a better place now. Well, they may question, as we discussed, isn't the best place here with me? The person who caused their death is going to suffer. You really need to make peace with it. God called them. Everything happens for a reason. And I will open this up for discussion. Is there anything anyone has said to you that you have found either helpful or not helpful? So one of the things I mentioned earlier in the presentation was that access to resources can impact how someone grieves. I would like to show this short video tour of our Grief Center, which is a resource in our community for anyone who is grieving a death. And before I show it, I do want to mention that due to safety measures, our center itself is closed, so we are not seeing individuals in person. However, we are seeing people virtually, both kids and adults, and we are also offering virtual support groups as well. And if we have heard that for kids, being on Zoom or Microsoft Teams or being online so much when they're often doing school online can be really challenging to have so much screen time. So we did create activity art kits that are related to grief, and we do mail those out for free from our Grief Support Center. So if you or anyone you know a child that is grieving and would benefit from an at-home art project to help them cope and navigate their grief, we would be more than willing to send those out.
Welcome to the Grace Grief Support Center. We opened in 2017 with the goal of providing grief support to anyone in the community who is grieving a death. Our large meeting room is the space we use for our adult grief groups. This space is where we meet with people for individual grief support. Our smaller group room is an additional space for adult groups. Our family program is a program for school-aged children and their parents or caregivers, and each night before group we provide a meal to these families. This is our kitchen space where we share that meal before group begins. Each of our playrooms provides different materials for the kids to use as a way to express their grief. The first is the playroom, which is full of costumes and masks and puppets, dolls, and a home play area. The hospital room allows kids to play with hospital and medical equipment as a way to work through any questions or curiosities they might have. The quiet room includes a sand table, books, comfy seats, and a play tent. The art room allows kids to express themselves through a variety of art materials. Our tornado room is our space for large motor play and is a safe space for kids to move their bodies. In addition to being the space for our older kids, the teen room is also where we hold opening and closing circles with all of the kids on family program nights. The Grace Grief Support Center offers individual, group, and family programs for anyone who is grieving a death. Please reach out for additional information at 608-327-7110 or at grace.org/grief support.
Okay, so that brings us to a closing for our webinar tonight. But before we end the presentation, I would like to open up a platform for discussion. Any questions or comments or feedback that anyone has? Mentioning how reaffirming it can be to just simply see a list of feelings and know that you're not alone, and to discuss areas of loss that you have experienced, death related or not. There are so many areas of loss throughout this entire pandemic, and it's so important to acknowledge that. And I don't think that through news coverage or through social media coverage that we've really seen enough acknowledgement regarding grief and regarding loss in this whole pandemic. And so it is important to discuss and important to be gentle with yourself because your feelings are valid.